Mr. Cisneros for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Mr. Dodaro, in adding VA's acquisition management to the high risk last year, the GAO cited evidence from its September 2018 report on the Veterans First program, which requires VA to give preference to veteran-owned small businesses when awarding contracts. Among other things, GAO found the VA training lacked clarity on how contracting officers should balance the preference for veteran-owned small businesses with fair and reasonable price determination when lower prices might be found on the open market. In addition, GAO found that the VA's online training sessions on the Veterans First policy were not mandatory, so only about 52% of VA contracting officers had completed the training. You recommended that the VA design more targeted training and consider making it mandatory. Can you tell me about the extent to which the VA has implemented this recommendation?
Yeah, first, the VA has clarified the guidance to contracting officers to have them document the determinations that they make, and they're actually doing some compliance checks now to make sure that that new policy is being implemented effectively. They are moving toward making the training mandatory and then providing it to all people. That hasn't fully happened yet, but they're on their way to having that accomplished.
So this is, I guess, some of the problems that we're seeing, right, when you talk about the management weakness. I mean, how difficult is it to make a mandatory training? It seems like it should be something that could be done with a simple letter.
At GAO, I make that decision. I make it right away. So it's important. I mean, they should be able to do this, but they also have to work with their union and all the union bargaining agreements and how the training would be provided, and so that may take some time.
Mr. Missel, you had said that you cannot implement the, and this is just to kind of really follow up on some of General Bergman's questions, but you said you can make recommendations, but you can't make the VA implement these recommendations.
That's correct.
So when you're, like you said, you'll designate an individual as to who's responsible for this recommendation is to handle it. I mean, some of these recommendations have been on the list for a long time. Are they being worked? Are they being ignored sometimes? Or why aren't these recommendations being implemented if we're really trying to make change?
It really varies. About 85 to 90% of the recommendations we make are closed within a year. And just with respect to the recommendations, while we can't require them to implement them, what we do when we make the recommendation is we ask VA if they're going to concur in it. VA concurs with almost all of our recommendations. We then ask them for an action plan. How are you going to implement it? So VA commits to the action plan, including the date when they think they'll be finished with it. So that gives us a structure to follow through. It's still VA's decision to do it. We can't require them, but by having an action plan, we can watch closely what they're doing.
But as you're going along, and like if a plan, well, let me ask you this. How often is a recommendation that you make where they say, we're not going to do this?
It's very rare. I think we've had a handful in the last few years.
All right. So they are working on all these recommendations that you're saying, but when something's taking 29 years, I mean, what is the root cause of that? Is it really coming back down to management again?
It's a few that are open more than 5 years, and they are correct. It's typically a staffing issue, or we get the sense it's not their priority. But if we see recommendations that are open for a long time that we think really need to be closed out, I don't hesitate to escalate it. For instance, if it's at a mid-level person, I will escalate it at VA. And I typically get a very positive reaction when I bring it up to explain that VA's committed to doing it, we think it's important, and it needs to have the right attention.
And one last question for Mr. Dodaro, and you could probably give us this one for the record because I'm running out of time, but there's always going to be turnover. We know that there's always, with each new administration, there's going to be a new secretary, there's going to be new assistant secretaries, but you talk about this, you talked about the weakness in management there at the VA. Is it at the bureaucratic level, or do we not have sustained professional managers there at the VA that can manage the day-to-day operations there? And I'm out of time, so if you could just submit that for the record, I'd appreciate that.
I will do that.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Cisneros. I now